Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Nandini, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for this year. Joy Harjo, U.S. Poet Laureate, wrote in the New York Times that when you understand history as linked stories, then it is no longer a misty past. The elders, the old ones, always believed that in the end, there would be justice for those who cared for and who had not forgotten the original teachings rooted in a relationship with the land. Justice is sometimes 7 generations away, or even more, and it is inevitable. Writing on behalf of the court for McGirt versus Oklahoma, Justice Neil Gorsuch ruled that because of an 1866 treaty that the Creek Nation signed with the United States, much of Oklahoma is still sovereign tribal land, and so indigenous people who allegedly commit crimes on that land must face justice in tribal or federal courts, not state ones. Questions still remain about what the decision means for the quality of justice in Indian country for natives and non-natives. Here to explore this topic further, we have journalist Cary Aspinwall. Cary Aspinwall is a Dallas-based staff writer for the Marshall Project. Previously, she was an investigative reporter at the Dallas Morning News, where she reported on the impact of pretrial incarceration and money bail on women and children in Texas, and deaths in police custody involving excessive force and medical negligence. She won the Gerald Loeb Award for reporting on a Texas company's history of deadly natural gas explosions and is a past Pulitzer finalist for her work exposing flaws in Oklahoma's execution process. She is also the co-founder of The Frontier, a nonprofit devoted to investigative journalism in Oklahoma. Ms. Aspinwall will present for roughly 25 minutes before jumping into conversation with me and Chris. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college, student, faculty, parent, alumni, or friend of the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Cary Aspinwall to the Athenaeum.
Hi, Claremont, McKenna. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. That was really, I feel very honored now. I'm glad to be here with y'all today, coming from Dallas. I'm sorry I can't be with you in California, but this is the nice germ-free version of the Athenaeum. Today I'm going to talk to you about the McGirt v. Oklahoma ruling, but you're going to have to bear with me for a little bit of history and a little bit of context about what I do and why this topic came to me at the Marshall Project. I'm part of our Southern States team, which does include Oklahoma, but because I was born in Colorado and I've lived all over the South and Southwest, I kind of branch over into other states occasionally. First of all, I wanted to ask, I can't see your faces, but how many of you have ever been to Oklahoma or have lived there? I don't know how many of the Claremont McKenna students are from, I met a couple of you so far, I know you're from all over the country. Oklahoma has a really unique history among US states. It was late to the party, it was not an old state, it doesn't have an old history with that. That's because it was Indian territory for a long time. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys so you can see this. This is a really awesome graphic created by Imran Kilderman from our, hang on, there it is. There we go. Hang on, technology, bear with me here. So this is a map of sort of Indian country, what we're going to be talking about today. You can see this is Oklahoma, and I have some other historical maps I'm going to share today. But for the purpose of this ruling, we're talking about these allotments that were given to the 5 tribes. This is what they're called: the Cherokee Nation, Muskogee Creek Nation, Choctaw Nation, Seminole Nation, and Chickasaw Nation. I'm not originally from Oklahoma, but it's actually the state I've lived in the longest. Like I said, I was born in Colorado. I grew up in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, and I've spent my entire adult life, career bouncing between Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona. So I'm not a tribal citizen. Nor do I have any indigenous heritage, but I have grown up in this culture and around tribal citizens and different, in Arizona, they have reservations. In Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation is just part of the landscape. So let me stop sharing for a second so I can advance the screen. But it's something that I think is so important when you tell these stories, because growing up the way I did, you always hear one side of it. Like for so long, the textbooks, the schooling that we were given, it was very much presented from the settlers' point of view, which is not the indigenous people's point of view. And so you have to kind of be really conscientious of thinking about things not from that perspective and not from that bias, because it is kind of ingrained into our culture, unfortunately, this lore of the Wild West and the frontier and the land run in Oklahoma. Well, there's always been another side to that story. And so one of the things we're very conscientious about with the Marshall Project is always getting the other side of the story. It's part of our mission. We are devoted to criminal justice, investigative journalism, because there is a huge problem with mass incarceration in this country. And we endeavor to tell all sides of that. And so this is something that was dear to my heart with this project. So it's part of this very complicated history of Oklahoma. Hang on, I got another map for you. I love sharing old maps. Sorry, you can bear with me here. All right, so this is pretty cool. This is actually from a friend's house. She has this. It's like an old school teaching map from Oklahoma. And you can see, I don't know how, depending on how good your screen resolution is, we'll try to bump this up a bit. So I don't know if you guys know the history of this. These tribes actually had ancestral homelands in other states. They were originally in Georgia, South Carolina, somewhere Florida. Like I grew up in Louisiana, so there were the Caddo Indians there. But they were forcibly removed from their homelands. You know the history of the Trail of Tears. And they were promised these allotments in Oklahoma as part of these treaties. So that's the origin of these treaties. And you can see this top map of Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. So that's right pre to statehood. The one below 1837 is some of the original allotments. So those are some of the original allotments in 1837, the Cherokee Nation, so Creek and Seminole in the middle, Choctaw and Chickasaw on the bottom, and then the Cherokee Outlet. And then you can see the bottom corner says in dispute with Texas. And then the Panhandle was under Mexican control because Texas was still, I think that was a long, hard fought battle over that piece of land. Hang on, so we're gonna go back from the maps. This is when I talk about sharing from one perspective and keeping in mind the other perspective always. I think this is a good lesson. The name Oklahoma. I had always been taught as a child that it actually meant Oklahoma, red people, but that's actually not what it means according to Choctaw language speakers. That is still what they teach children in Oklahoma a lot of the times, and you'll hear people unfortunately use that as a justification for like having a really racist team names like the Redskins. Like that is just, you'll see people say, well, the name of the state means red people. That's actually not a accurate translation according to people who are much more educated in the Choctaw language than I am. Oklahoma, it's a little more complex. So Okla in the Choctaw language means a group of people who share a language and culture. So when Choctaw speakers think of the word Okla, they think of it meaning like our people. The broadest and most generic definition according to them should be the Choctaw Nation. If you think of it, if you speak any French, I think of it as similar to like nous. Hama can mean red, crimson, or a color or a state of redness. But in this context, there is an honorific in the Choctaw language that means, it's an honorific for courage or a distinction for someone who's shown like courage in battle. So the people who are much more studied on this than I am believe that it means courageous people or brave people. So it's much more than just the color of someone's skin. So I always think of this when I think about these stories that we're told growing up and the history that we're told. It matters who's telling it, and it matters getting all perspectives and really understanding it. So now you know, Oklahoma doesn't technically mean red people. And I started my journalism career in Oklahoma as a young reporter. I graduated college from Oklahoma State University. And you know, these part of Indian affairs and different things that are going on with the Cherokee Nation, the business of the tribes, it's always part of the local coverage there. And it's part of it in terms of like the elections for chief and just things that happen. There are big contracts with the state. It's always a thing that's been part of our coverage area as journalists in Oklahoma. The other thing that's always been part of my coverage area because of criminal justice journalism that I've done is that Oklahoma as a state locks up more women per capita than any other state in the US. And this is something I've been writing about for a long time. Last fall, they actually did something that really surprised me. Oklahoma did a mass commutation docket where they let a lot of people out of prison who were serving low-level drug sentences. And a good number of them were women. And a lot of them were Native women, a portion of them. So unfortunately, even with that, they're still #1 per capita for women because they are so far and above the other states. And the reason I bring this up is that it's not a new problem. We did a project in 2011 for the Tulsa World, the newspaper I worked at there back then, about women in prison. And one of the stories that really resonated with people was about a woman named Patricia Spotted Crow, who happens to be a Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal citizen who was serving 12 years for a $31 sale of marijuana. And if I can share this screen, I'm gonna try and play a little video for you. We'll see how well this works, I'm not sure. But I'm sure this sounds outrageous to folks in California where this is legal now, and also for the amount, but this is not actually rare in Oklahoma, unfortunately.
How do you tell your kids goodbye? I mean, that morning I woke up, I didn't kiss or hug no one. I didn't have my mom, my kids, or anybody. They were still asleep. I knew I was coming home. I mean, I didn't kiss my husband, nothing. My daughter just started talking, and I'm not even there. They're fixing to have their first Christmas without me, you know. For sure, it's everywhere. The drugs are everywhere, and so, like I said, it was easy money. You know, everybody gets a vacation, everybody gets a break. I still get Christmas. Nobody knows what's going on. You know.
Patricia Spotted Crow received a 12-year prison sentence for selling $31 of marijuana to a police informant. Her children were in the house during the transaction, which makes the penalty more severe. But given the circumstances, many would consider Spotted Crow's sentence harsh.
All right. So that's just a little snippet of a video that we made about Patricia's story. There's a very talented multimedia journalist who used to work at The World named Adam Wisniewski. And Jenny Graham was the journalist who originally found Patricia's story and told it. And then I kind of followed up years later. I was part of the big project. But it was just kind of outrageous to us that this mother with all these small children at home was sentenced to 12 years. They reduced the sentence to 10 initially. And then after we did that story, it caused enough outrage that they went ahead and gave her early parole, which brings me to a much happier picture. Hang on, just to share this with you so it's not all doom and gloom. There we go. This is Patricia Spotted Crow on the day she got out of prison. This is a photo I took on my cell phone because I happened to be there for part of the story. We found out she was getting out and we were able to go to her home and be there as she saw her mom, and she was there. Her kids didn't know she was getting out, and so they got home from school, and you can see she's lifting her little daughter here. So that is just something I always keep in mind when telling these stories, because I think it's just, there are real people behind all of this. And like I said, the Californians are probably freaking out about the fact that this woman got 12 years for a dime bag. She spent about, I would say 2 years in between when that story ran and when she got out. And she actually has had legal trouble since for fines and fees. They threw her back in, I think last year or the year before that, because she had unpaid fines. Luckily, some folks came to her aid and raised a fund for her. But this is not unusual in Oklahoma. We send women to very long sentences for very small drug crimes. They are trying to remedy that through a series of state law reforms. Oklahoma is unusual in a sense that the state system is what chews up and spits out these women and Indigenous women, and they go to state prison instead of federal. Most Indigenous women, most Native women in states like North Dakota and Arizona, where they live on reservations, they get caught up by the federal prison system because the state doesn't regulate the drug crimes there. So they get caught up for even a minor drug crime like that. They're going to serve time in the federal system, and federal sentencing guidelines are very strict, very harsh. There's not a lot of flexibility. So unfortunately, they get sent very far away from home, and that's a huge issue. I'm going to show you guys this quote from a lady that I think is really powerful. So basically, when the parents get sent away to federal prison, sometimes they go years without seeing their children or their families because the extra expense of traveling to a faraway prison, federal prison, you are not sent anywhere near your home state necessarily. They might take that into account, but a lot of times they don't. And this plays into the next story I'm going to share with y'all. This is a woman named Andrea Circlebear, and you may have heard of her story because it caught a lot of headlines earlier this year. Andrea was a citizen of the Cheyenne Sioux River tribe in South Dakota, and she was transferred from her home state earlier this year to federal prison in Texas, in Fort Worth, near where I am. And she had to leave behind her 5 children, and she was pregnant at the time of her transfer. A few days after she arrived at the federal prison in Fort Worth, she was 8 months pregnant. They took her to the hospital with pneumonia-like symptoms, and it turned out she had COVID-19. The baby was delivered by cesarean section, emergency C-section the next day, and then Circle Bear died within 3 weeks. She never got a chance to meet or hold her baby. So this is one of the kind of absurdities of the system, if you will. This family's woman begged the judge in South Dakota to let her serve time closer to home. She was pregnant. You know, prison is supposed to be for people who we consider dangerous or violent. I don't know about an 8-month pregnant woman who was serving time on a minor drug charge. Seems like they could have put her on an ankle monitor. They do it all the time. You've seen some famous friends of the presidents get put on ankle monitors during COVID. This woman was sent to a medical facility, a federal prison in Fort Worth, very far away from her friends and family and home and her children, and she died. So we wrote about it at the Marshall Project. There's an article about hers and what some other, what women dying in prison of COVID-19 were telling us about female incarceration. And I think about this a lot. There's no evidence that putting her in prison for any amount of time would ever help anyone, said Felicity Rose, who works for an advocacy group for Forward. They try to reform women's correctional sentences. And now, not only is this not improving anyone's public safety, it's actually taking a mother away from her tiny brand new baby who needs her as well as her other children. So you have to really question, like, is this about public safety or is it about punishment? And I knew the Pardon and Parole Board member was an old Baptist minister in Oklahoma, and he was a real colorful, interesting guy. He'd been a DEA agent when he was younger. And he told me once, and this always sticks with me, I can stop sharing my screen now, but he said, in Oklahoma, we like to put women in prison because we're mad at them, not afraid of them. Nobody was actually afraid of Andrea Circle Bear. So that's just my soapbox about my stories that I've done and our coverage on that issue. Now we're going to talk about McGirt, which is the reason you all are here. So that's a little background on that issue in this context of women being over-incarcerated both in Oklahoma and the state system, and Native women in the federal system as well. So you guys have heard us refer to Oklahoma as Indian country. This ruling in July, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that these treaties dating back 2 centuries, so a good portion of eastern Oklahoma, is Indian country. And what that means is basically a huge victory for the tribes in terms of recognizing their sovereignty and recognizing treaties that always should have been honored. And it also affects the administration of criminal justice for about 500,000 tribal citizens in Oklahoma. You know, this was something that they really felt strongly about. They were very passionate about. You could see in the friends that I have that are Cherokee, Choctaw, you know, it meant a lot to them. These treaties had been reneged on for decades and decades by the federal government. And it cost a huge human cost to them. And so this meant a lot to see this recognized in this manner. And we're going to quote somebody here in a second. Sorry, pardon my quotes. But I think this is really poignant, and so I wanted to share with you. This is from the majority opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch, who is from my home state of Colorado. On the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. Forced to leave their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama, the Creek Nation received assurances that their new lands in the West would be secure forever. In exchange for ceding all their land east of the Mississippi River, the U.S. government agreed by treaty that the Creek Nation, country west of the Mississippi, shall be solemnly guaranteed to the Creek Indians. Sounds like a pretty solid promise, right? So hang on, I'll stop sharing the screen so I can talk to you. Yeah, so it was a big promise, and these tribes are been so used to the government leaving them high and dry on these treaties. So that line on the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. I saw so many friends tweeting that, quoting it, people who are tribal citizens. It really meant a lot to see that recognition. So we're going to rewind a little bit to the history about those treaties. In about 1834, there was a mass forced relocation of indigenous folks. We talked about that a little bit, from the Southeast US to present day Oklahoma. Remember the map I showed you guys? And Indian Territory was sort of the designation of the state, but Indian country is that tribal designation in the treaty, but it actually has to do with federal law and for criminal law. So basically, Washington had power over this territory, not the states. So when they forcibly removed these tribes from their homes, the idea was that the federal government would have some jurisdiction over it, but the tribes would be free to rule themselves under their own systems and own government. But then there was a decision called Ex parte Crow Dog. And that basically was that there was a homicide between two members of the same tribe, or the Sioux tribe and another tribe in North Dakota. And the tribes themselves relied on a system of restorative justice. That's something we talk a lot about now, but it's something that was always part of their culture in certain tribes. And they decided that the one chief that was murdered, the other tribal member would have to make restitution to the victim's family. And they had their own way of doing that. And the Supreme Court affirmed this decision. There were some people who tried to challenge it and say, no, he should be punished, because back then in the Wild West, the local system of justice was very much a hang 'em high, you hang them at the courthouse. This is the traditional role of county sheriffs in these areas. And the local citizens were outraged that they chose to go with this more restorative system of justice. In their mind, capital punishment was the only way. So ex parte Crow Dog stood in that case, but then Congress got involved and they passed the Major Crimes Act. And that gave the federal courts jurisdiction over violent felonies involving Indigenous citizens. So the states didn't have jurisdiction, but the federal system did. But if you ask the tribes, they weren't given input on this. And so it was forced on them. And it was something that they never really wanted. So let's talk about that. So they have their land that's been given to them. Well, then what happens? And I got another map for you, bear with me. All right, I like this one. These old school maps. These are like actually maps that hung in like school classrooms in Oklahoma that my friend has now. So no, we talk about history and who's sharing it. The land openings, right? So were they land openings, or were they giving something away they had promised to someone else? Yeah, that's a matter of perspective. As a child in Oklahoma, you're taught about land runs, but that was someone else's land that they were giving away. They had promised it, and each tribe handled things differently. The Creeks and the Cherokees, I believe, held the land communally. The Osage Reservation had land by allotment. I can't remember, an expert we talked to at University of Oklahoma explained this to me. But so when the land was open, then they started seizing the lands that had been given to the Indians under these treaties, and they lost their land. And so basically they still had tribal trust and fee land, but it started chipping away. And then Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And slowly you see what they call disestablishment. The reservation was disestablished. So what had been local control for the tribes, what had been their control, was given away to the state of Oklahoma without their consent. And that basically the 5 tribes that were most affected by that, because they had the 5 tribes had a unique contract with it. The Osages had a different deal. Some of the other tribes had their lands given away first. But this is why Oklahoma is a little bit different than what you think of as like the reservation that Andrea Circlebear lived on, or the reservations that the folks in Arizona lived on. So it is different the way that the reservation lands work, because it was disestablished and taken over by the state essentially and sold as private property. So what does this mean? It's a lot of legal stuff. But what the McGirt decision means is that, lands that were designated Indian country by treaties with the US government, they remain Indian country now for the purposes of federal criminal law. That is basically the gist of that decision. It really the narrow scope of it was focused on criminal law, and it was focused on two cases that happened on the lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So it technically only applies to that right this second, but the general thought is that it's going to be challenged very quickly and spread out to all of 5 tribes' land. But to the tribal citizens, this is a ruling that could have ramifications beyond just criminal justice, beyond just criminal case law. What other tribal sovereignty could be respected? What other treaties also need to be ruled on? So that is a question that remains. But because I work for the Marshall Project, we're only going to talk about criminal justice. And the answer is it's kind of complicated. This created a lot of chaos in Oklahoma temporarily. The tribes have their own criminal justice system. They have their own courts. They have their own light horse policemen. They have the Supreme Court. But for the most part, they do minor crimes, because technically the state was handling major crimes. But now the federal government is handling major crimes. So the U.S. Attorney's Office in Tulsa and in Muskogee, which is a city, not the tribal land. There's Muskogee Creek Nation and there's Muskogee the city. They're not the same thing. So those federal prosecutors' offices are now very, very busy. And we did a story about this for the Marshall Project, about the nuance and what will be handled now and kind of the extra load of that. And in order to do that story for the Marshall Project, we actually teamed up with a dear friend of mine, Graham Lee Brewer, who is a very talented journalist in Oklahoma and also a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And it's his birthday today, so happy birthday, Graham. But he writes for High Country News, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't just telling one side of the story, right? So we did this story together, and I'm really proud of it because I think it had a lot of perspectives in it. But it's complicated, right? The laboratories of democracy can get messy, is the way I kept explaining to my editor. In the middle, the federal prosecutors usually handle a lot of immigration, a lot of drug crime, a lot of trafficking, human trafficking sometimes. They don't do a lot of homicide, a lot of typical cases that your county prosecutor does. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. There are folks who are worried that, shifting all these cases to the federal system just means that there will be more over-incarceration of Indigenous men and women in the federal system. The tribes are hopeful that they can shift some of that back to their own court system, and possibly that this could create a really interesting experiment for criminal justice reform in Oklahoma. Could they handle more of their cases and go back to a more restorative system of justice, a more kind of looking at the whole person? There's a lot of thought now with treating drug crimes and through drug treatment instead of punishing people. So they're looking at it as like a way to kind of reform that system. But I do worry that I don't want more women getting caught up like Andrea Circlebear, and I don't want more women getting sentences like Patricia Spotted Crow. So I'm going to keep checking up on them because Oklahoma already incarcerates too many women and too many Native women, including the quote I showed you earlier from Isabel Coronado. Her own mother was incarcerated in Oklahoma as a child, which is why she works on this issue. She's a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and this is a very near and dear issue to her. She works for an advocacy think tank. So, they're just trying the best they can. This has put a lot of load on the officers there. I'm going to show you some, this is not a map. It's interesting. Okay, so this is a card that the police officers are given in Oklahoma, in this part of Oklahoma. It's eastern Oklahoma. So the officers have to now ask themselves, is the defendant an Indian? Is the victim an Indian or non-Indian? And so that tells you, if you look at it, there's a different jurisdiction. If the victim or defendant is an Indian, then it changes the jurisdiction of the case. It has to go to federal court if it's major crime, or tribal court if it's minor crime. If it's a non-Indian versus an Indian, then it goes to federal. And non-Indian victimless, state jurisdiction. So there's all these little things that these officers are having to think about when they write the report, because they can't, the charge goes to a different court. So this is their handy little card that the officers carry in their wallet. It has created problems. There is a backup at the county jail in Tulsa. I have some friends at Frontier that wrote about that. Folks who are Indian, who are accused of committing a crime, have been waiting for counsel, for bond hearings. The court system as a whole right now is kind of a mess because of COVID. But I did talk to the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District in the story, and I got an update from him because he also happens to be a friend of mine from I went to high school with, Trent Shores, who is also a citizen of the Choctaw Nation. So I'm gonna share this screen with y'all so you can get some numbers. All right. So it is taxing their resources a bit, and they have been given some additional funding from the Department of Justice, but it's a 300% increase per month in the number of indictments. They don't have the capacity to do all the cases they'd like to do. This is an office typically for federal prosecutors. They don't handle as many as your typical county court prosecutor. They typically would get like 15 to 20 indictments a month. They got 92 just in the first month. They are able to refer some of those to the tribal courts when they're not major crimes. They're trying to prioritize things like homicides, child sexual abuse, things that are violent with child or victims, like homicide victims. So, but it's, they've got to, suddenly they're dispatching FBI agents to the scene of domestic violence complaints. That's very different. And the Eastern Oklahoma U.S. Attorney office is even smaller, so they have fewer resources. It's a challenge, but they're figuring it out, and he's very committed to like the rule of law. But that means that this office that typically, I think he told me, I've been busy like I've never been busy before. It's just unbelievable. So they got those 300 some odd cases, 360 cases referred to his office just since July 9th. They've retained 180 of them. The others were referred to the Muskogee Creek Nation courts, but that includes 21 homicides. The entire U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District only prosecuted 3 homicides in the past 20 years. Typically, those homicides were always going to county court, to the district attorney for Tulsa County. So that is something that will be interesting to watch, and the Marshall Project will be watching it. So it's messy. right? Like I said, the laboratories of democracy, but the law is the law. And the tribes weren't the ones who screwed this up. The federal government did, or the state did, by imposing it on them. So it's kind of the federal government's responsibility to make it right, since they went back on all those treaties. And most tribal citizens want to protect sovereignty above all else, because they fought for these rights to be recognized for so long. And they've had their frustrations over the years for the government going back on it. I think we're trying to wrap up my little portion so y'all can ask me some questions. But there are some other ramifications for this. Like there was everyone's worried about like what will happen beyond criminal justice. And you could tell there were some public officials who, they were very concerned about the ruling. They had a lot to say about this, but what they were really worried about were the other treaties that could affect. And I think this is interesting if you keep watching. The EPA just issued a ruling that granted Oklahoma state government control of environmental issues on tribal lands. And special points for anyone who can tell me why that might be. All right, let me just show, I'm gonna throw out my email for y'all so you can send me a note if you need to with a silly GIF. Hang on. All right, gotta do it there. Share screen. Sorry, technology guys. All right, so this should have had my email on it, but it didn't pop up. I don't know where it is. My email is C.Aspinwall at the Marshall Project. We can get that for you guys, but this is my David Pumpkins for any questions, and special happy birthday to Graham Lee Brewer, my co-author. I don't know if he's here, but thank you guys. Let's do some questions now and let me know what else you want to know about McGirt, Oklahoma, or criminal justice issues there.
I can start. Thank you so much for your talk. My first question kind of goes back to something that you've brought up throughout your talk about how you're trying to get the other side of the story. So I want to know what that process looks like for you as an investigative journalist, and what value getting the other side of the story has.
Sure. Well, it's just that, you know, if the whole of history is that only one side gets told, then it's really, you know, it's just, I'm trying to think about this in terms of both the reporting on Indigenous folks and also for criminal justice. Well, part of the way that we get the situation that we're in with criminal justice is that, and we have a responsibility to talk about this as media, is that for so long we were only telling one side of the story, right? And I see this because I'm an investigative journalist now. As a young reporter, I was a police reporter where you go to the scene of different crimes and you talk about what happens, you interview the police, and you just put a little report of what happened down there, but it's all the police and prosecutors' side of the story. You don't always, like, there were good reporters who always did this, but it wasn't, you know, standard practice in the industry to always go make sure it was a fully well fleshed out story. You see this a lot with people. A lot of media organizations are rethinking the way that they do mugshots with stories when someone's first arrested, because just because you're arrested does not mean you committed a crime. It means you're suspected of committing a crime. So that in the mugshot stays up on a newspaper's website, a TV station's website, it leaves a lasting mark. That article may not get purged when you maybe get cleared and you're not found guilty. So a lot of people in the media are rethinking this. It's something when I switched over to investigative reporting, and I had to go do investigations on old murder cases, and you would find out, oh, there was evidence presented or that didn't get presented that should have been, and maybe this person didn't do it. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me as a young reporter and as an investigative journalist, to go back and have to re-report a story and see that there's this other side that hadn't always been told. So that is something I always think about, and I think about it in the context with the Indigenous stories, because there's this other side that's not, you know, if you looked at just the court records for Andrea Circlebear's case, you'd think, oh, wait, she's maintaining a drug-involved premises, she must be part of a drug ring. Well, sometimes what that means is that she was living in a house with a boyfriend who was running drugs. You know, there was a lady I met in prison in Oklahoma, and the DA got real mad, and we were doing a story about her because her child lived with her at a halfway house, and the DA said, well, you know, she was a bad girl, she dealt drugs, she had drugs in her diaper bag. Well, her boyfriend was a drug dealer and had hidden the drugs there. So there's always these other little sides to the story that don't get told. And this is definitely, every time I delve into the history and with tribal citizens, tribal culture, when you actually delve into like the other side of the story, you learn this whole other thing that you weren't taught in school. And it's definitely our job as journalists, as students, as, you know, citizens of the world, to go and make sure we're getting all of the information. Hope that answers your question. Sorry, I'll go. If you let me, I'll just keep going off on tangents about women in prison in Oklahoma.
Thank you. Well, kind of going off of that, you and I think you've kind of answered this question in a way, but you've mentioned that you have talked to and know some of these women. And I guess I kind of wanted to know, as a non-Indigenous person, how do you ensure that you're respecting kind of the perspectives and the history from the Native side, which has been ignored for so long?
Well, you just go ask the people who know a lot more than you, right? Like I was very lucky. There are some, well, first of all, the tribes themselves have attorney generals, each of them, who are, brilliant scholars in tribal law in the background. They know this front and back, so they're the experts. The U.S. attorney himself is actually very well versed in tribal law. It's part of why he has that post and why he worked in that office for so long. There are some amazing scholars at University of Oklahoma. There's an there's a tribal law program there that you can actually study at, and this is actually something for the state of Oklahoma. Now they're gonna have to consider adding it to the bar exam there for attorneys, because if you're gonna practice as an attorney in Oklahoma, you really need to know this now. So it's something that they probably will have to add to the bar exam and to like the continuing or legal education curriculum and your CLE if you're gonna go to law school. But yeah, I just go ask people who know more than I do and listen to it. And then just try to read everything you can, because it's interesting to me, I had Oklahoma history growing up, but they typically would have you take it in like one semester with a PE coach. So just in my reporting that I've done, and I have friends who are members of several of the nations, and you ask them, you hear about it from them, and you read things, because there's been people who really have documented the other side of it. It just wasn't the side that was what the majority wanted to hear. We're finding this a lot also in Tulsa. This has been a huge issue for the race massacre. When I was growing up, the Tulsa race massacre was taught as the Tulsa race riot. Well, whose perspective is that being taught from? So this is really, I think it's a reckoning we're having as a nation, but it's a really interesting, Oklahoma has a very interesting, unique perspective in terms of the indigenous culture, Black Wall Street, what's happened there. So it's really our highest calling as reporters is to go find I think the Woodward and Bernstein always called it the best obtainable version of the truth. So you go looking for the truth and you try to make sure, has it really been told, or is this just what someone's trying to sell us?
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting. That
yeah, Tulsa is Oklahoma is a fascinating state, and Tulsa is a very fascinating city.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there are people who are well versed in tribal law. So how different is tribal law from state and federal law?
I am not a legal scholar, so I don't know. But it's not, the way things are operating are not that different. There are limits to what the tribes can sentence. They have there are different tribes have different maximums, but basically I don't think any of the tribes can sentence for any longer than 1 or 2 years. And so that's the primary difference. They do have, some of the nations have their own rehabilitation programs for people who are drug offenders who are coming out. The key issue, a lot of this, and McGirt and Murphy, I skipped over that slide, but McGirt and Murphy, the cases that were a part of this ruling were tough to be argued. It was a tough, they're arguing on the principle of sovereignty, right, and of the treaties. The cases themselves were very unsavory. You had a child sexual abuse case of a repeat offender, and the other one was a homicide where they killed the romantic rival. And that guy is ostensibly on death row. I think they're going to try and retry his case in the federal system, and the federal prosecutors have said they intend to seek the death penalty again. But most of we have a really great article on the Marshall Project website for people who are interested in this about the tribes, the indigenous culture, and the distaste for the death penalty. Most of them have to opt in for federal death penalty, and almost all of them have opted out except for one tribe. And basically, there was a case recently where they went ahead and executed somebody who was a tribal citizen, and it was in opposition to what his tribe wanted. So it's messy. That is probably the biggest difference between state and, they don't have the right to execute people under tribal law yet, but I think most of the tribes would say that they are anti-death penalty, because especially the way that it's been carried out in Oklahoma has not been, it's supposed to be the federal standard when it got challenged in the Supreme Court was arbitrary and capricious. Many people would argue it's still arbitrary and capricious, and it breaks down on racial lines if you look at the numbers. So I think that's a big change. But I think it would be interesting to see. Tulsa does have some progressive programs in its county court for like drug court. There's a program called Women in Recovery. And so I can see a lot of programs like that being the jurisdiction of the tribal courts now, to try and say you could divert a woman like Andrea Circlebear instead of sending her to federal prison. Well, that would be ideal, right? There's no reason for that to be happening.
This is really interesting because I read Killers of the Flower Moon in my literary journalism.
Such a good book.
Yeah, and there's so many parallels to all of this. But
Yeah.
speaking of tribal law, what do you think is the biggest challenge that tribal courts now face given this new responsibility that they'll have?
Just the tax on the resources. I think that they've been given additional money to hire additional police officers, additional prosecutors, that's really the issue, is there haven't been, I think the U.S. Attorney's Office was given a couple of volunteers from other jurisdictions in the country to help be prosecutors, but then you need federal public defenders to help with those cases. And the tribes need public defenders and prosecutors too. And not everyone has this area of training of law. There are people who can catch up really quick, but the volume of cases is suddenly tripled. And it's complicated. So hopefully they're getting the resources they need. I know the tribes have said that they're going to provide resources. I left this out of the slideshow, but one of the things that was kind of controversial that happened immediately after the ruling, the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma, Mike Hunter, had anticipated this. They sat and looked at McGirt and Murphy and saw that when the court granted cert, like, this is coming, this could happen. So they worked out a deal with the chiefs of some of the 5 tribes, I think pretty much all of them, and said, okay, well, here's the deal. We're going to respect tribal sovereignty, but we're going to go ahead and keep, for now, the criminal jurisdiction over these typical cases. We're going to keep it in state courts. And the chiefs had agreed to it. Well, as soon as that was announced, the citizens of those nations were livid because they were not consulted, is what we were told from people who were mad about it. And they viewed that as an immediate assault to sovereignty, which is what they had fought so hard for. And it's not that anybody wants people to get away with murder or get away with this, or, sexual abuse. It's just that they view the fight over sovereignty as so essential to their rights as citizens of sovereign nations. And having those treaties respected is a huge part of it. So that deal was announced, and within a couple of days it fell apart. There's like a quick line about it in our story, but it was interesting to watch it all because that happened as we're reporting the story. We're like, oh, well, here's this agreement. Oh, I guess everything's going to stay the same. And the citizens were like, no, it's not. And that's what happened. So the chiefs listened to their citizens, and I think the AG was a little mad because he thought he had a deal worked out. But, it's complicated. And then you get things like the state government officials, what are they really worried about? Well, the EPA regulations, because they don't want anything to be pushed back on oil or fracking or drilling, those kind of, there are other parties that have other concerns that have nothing to do with criminal justice. And I think there was a legal group that used this ruling already. I haven't checked up on what the status of that case is to try and challenge, the Trump administration has kind of gone back on federal lands that are considered like preservation or Florida national parks. Bears Ears Monument in Utah is the one I'm thinking of. And they filed a lawsuit in court seeking to undo some of what the Trump administration was trying to do with giving away some of the land of Bears Ears for either development or oil. I can't remember if it was for drilling or for industrial use. So, the way these cases work is it starts a precedent and then that precedent trickles outward. So we'll have to see what happens and what the ramifications will be for other areas of law beyond criminal. Now the ruling is that it's Indian country because Congress never ruled, they never disestablished the reservation and declared that. So there is a thought that there will be some members of Congress that try to go back in and get some kind of federal rule saying, oh, this could go back, impose some more jurisdiction on the tribal lands of Oklahoma or give the jurisdiction back to state courts. But I would anticipate a big fight about that. I don't think the citizens of these tribes want that. So hopefully the congressman for Oklahoma will listen to their constituents, but we'll see. I don't know. It's always, money always wins out on these things. So.
Thank you. Yeah, Killers of the Flower Moon is Martin Scorsese's next film.
Such an awesome book. You guys, if you haven't read it, please read that book. It's so good. It's about the Osage Nation, and there's a little Texas component to it, the Texas Strangers, and it's gonna be a movie, right? That's a Scorsese movie. They're filming it in Oklahoma, or maybe they've already started. COVID probably put a hold on it.
So maybe I like kind of missed something, but I'm still a bit confused about like how sovereignty and autonomy like of kind of like native land works, and um, how does that sovereignty like how is like legal sovereignty different from like sovereignty maybe in like the way we think about it, and like how like kind of to what extent is that sovereignty like actual autonomy as like a
Well, so they're still contained with like, they still pay taxes, right? So like they're still, but they can levy their own thing. They have their own license plate. They have their own government. They can levy their own taxes. And this McGirt is solely focused on the criminal law issue, and basically says, okay, the Major Crimes Act, and you never just establish the reservation. So now it reverts to federal rule. It's just the state courts can't prosecute you, basically. So that doesn't really affect sovereignty because you can still be prosecuted in federal court, you know. The sovereignty has more to do with their right to have their own court system and their right to have their own hearings. And so it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out if they eventually are able to establish that if it's a major crime, you go to tribal court. It's too far out to tell what will happen with that. I think there are tribes that would like to have that as their goal, but I don't know that anyone is set up for that yet. I don't know if the Congress is going to let that happen. But you know, there are people who feel really strongly about it, and you know, it has to do with things like housing and courts, and there are, you know, their own laws and systems. It's different, but and also it's the right to create compacts and treaties with the government, right? Like, as a sovereign nation, you can negotiate. There's a big thing in Oklahoma, it's totally unrelated to criminal justice, but about the tribal gaming compacts, because a lot of the business of the tribes of the state has to do with these casinos that they have. You guys may have driven through and seen like the big casinos in Oklahoma, like Thackerville is one, and there's one talking about Cherokee Nation has one near Tulsa. There's a big dispute between the governor of Oklahoma and the tribes about the tribal gaming compacts. He wanted to come in and renegotiate them, and the tribes were not in the mood of it. So it's complicated. A lot of it has to do with business stuff sometimes. For criminal justice, it's pretty clearly spelled out for now, but I'm really curious to see what will happen long term if they try to shift it all to the U.S. Attorney's Office or they try to shift it back to the tribes. And I think, you know, if there starts to be too many more Andrea circle bearers, if that starts to be further booming the population of Indigenous folks in the federal prison system, where like I see some pushback from the tribes. This is not what they want. They don't want that. They don't want people going and serving long sentences for minor drug crimes.
You'd mentioned earlier that someone told you that the reason why Oklahoma prosecutes so many women is because they're afraid of women. So the next question is basically, are they afraid of all women or particularly Native women? And do non-Native Oklahoman women have a higher incarceration rate than women in other states?
Yes, so the quote was that Oklahoma likes to put women in prison because they're mad at them, not because they're afraid of them. So they're not afraid of them. They're actually just mad at them because it's a very kind of paternalistic, moralistic state where they think they got involved in drug crime, or they, you know, they had, and so they put these harsh, you will see men and women in Oklahoma committing the same crime and the woman gets a longer sentence, especially if she had her children involved. Tondalo Hall was a famous case of this. BuzzFeed did a really good investigation, but she was accused of allowing her boyfriend to abuse her child. And I can't remember if he killed the child or just injured it, but he was accused of actually injuring the child, and she was accused of allowing it to occur. And she got a longer sentence than her boyfriend. And this is not uncommon. I see this in Texas too. It's actually, Oklahoma has a very appalling incarceration rate for white, Black, and Native women. It's bad all around. I think the Native women and Black women are overrepresented, like, and maybe Hispanic women, they're definitely overrepresented in the prison system per their population of Oklahoma's population. But Oklahoma is bad per capita, which means per its population of citizens, they put too many women in per the population of citizens. So there may be, like, Texas or California has more women by volume total, but by the population of the state of Oklahoma per capita, they incarcerate way more than any other state. Texas is in the mix, but it's not nearly as bad. Mississippi, Louisiana are usually also terrible for women. Sometimes I think Tennessee or Georgia, and those tend to be the top states for men too. Texas is usually among the number one for men. California and Texas by volume are just huge. I mean, I think the Los Angeles County Jail, just the county jail in LA is bigger than most states' prison systems. I only know this because the Marshall Project has been tracking COVID-19 in jails and prisons across the country. And we were doing inventories and looking at censuses, and Cook County and, you know, Rikers Island in New York, some of these county jails have massive jails that are the size of, like, you know, the entire Kansas prison system. So it's, or bigger though. But Oklahoma is per capita far and away. And actually, when you look at the incarceration rate for women, especially, the United States as a whole is terrible. Our female incarceration rate as a country is actually like as bad as like China, Russia, and Iran. So we're like in these with, or I think we may be worse than China. I haven't looked at this chart in a while, but it's terrible. If we were a country like I think it's the Prison Policy Initiative, or one of the groups has some amazing charts on the incarceration of women and girls, because it goes to the juvenile system too. You see young black females over incarcerated per their percentage of the population heavily for, you know, minor offenses in school. There's been some really good reporting on that issue. So it's not just something that happens to Native women. In Oklahoma, it's terrible for white, Native, Hispanic, and Black women. They're so bad at it that it's bad for all populations. But you do see a little bit too much per capita higher rate for, I mean, I think percentage, it has to look, you look at it relative to their percentage of the state population of that. So it's complicated, but it's bad for all the women. And, you know, the stat that I always keep in mind, and it's a big part of my reporting, is that 80% of these women that we're sending, especially in county jails, which is where most women in the country are locked up. They sit in county jail waiting for trial or serving short sentences for minor crimes. 80% of those women are mothers that have children. So where do the children go? Sorry, if you guys let me, I'll just keep talking about that. So does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, yeah, sorry about
Okay.
that. No problem. So yeah, thinking about like the criminal justice system, I'm glad you brought that up. Kind of thinking through this lens or perspective of of Native people, but specifically Native women, as long as like kind of the state and federal courts in the United States kind of do have like quite a large jurisdiction over these crimes that occur on Native land. Like what sort of kind of changes or reform, or perhaps more than that, should kind of be considered or thought about or supported, knowing that that over incarceration affects Native women, women of color, Black women?
Yeah. So, I mean, I always tell people, because I've gone to a lot of jails and prisons in Oklahoma and Texas, and I've never met a rich girl in prison. So it's a poverty issue for a lot of these women. You know, most of the time when women get caught up in drug crime, they're trying to feed their children or buy diapers. So I did a story about a lady here in Texas that was sitting in the county jail for 2 months. Her bail was set at $150,000. She had stolen 2 school uniforms from Old Navy. Total value of the crime was $100. So it's just, the system was set up for men, and it's designed for big bad men that we're supposed to be afraid of, but they're violent men. The idea was that you are supposed to be the principle of liberty. You're supposed to be able to be released until you are convicted of a crime. Like you're arrested, you post a bond, or they let you out on your own recognizance if you're not a flight risk. But the system has been very, very messed up in recent years, and because of cash bail. So there's a lot of people who think that cash bail as reform will benefit women the most because they're hurt the most by it. Women have less, I think it's like 60% of net wealth of men, and that's white women. Black women, Hispanic women have far less net wealth than men. So cash bail hits them harder. They're less likely to be able to get out because they have kids at home that they're not as likely to be well paid if they have a job. So that's definitely one thing that would help women out tremendously. The other thing is, a lot of reform for drug sentencing. I mean, now it strikes me as really tough when I go to California, when I go to Colorado, and I see that marijuana is legal in both those places. I've met people, Patricia was going to serve 12 years in prison for a dime bag of marijuana. How is that a just system where you can, in one state it's perfectly legal, you can do whatever if you have money, and then, so it's just, that's something. And you have people who are serving very long sentences. This is actually on the ballot in Oklahoma for repeat offenders, because what they do is when you first mess up, and it's common for people who are addicted to drugs or using drugs to survive or get by, they get arrested more than once. And it's a tough cycle to break out of. So they repeatedly end up in the system because they can't afford to get out, and prison makes you even poorer than you already are. And you can't find housing because once you're a convicted felon, it's harder to find housing. Even a misdemeanor can make that harder. So they end up back in the system. And what do? We lengthen their sentence. We give them an overly long, harsh sentence because they're a repeat offender. And that's something that's on the ballot right now in Oklahoma, trying to adjust or remove those sentence enhancements for repeat offenders, just because it's caught up so many people in the prison system. And those are things that a lot of people are looking at. A lot of places have legalized marijuana. They're technically, Dallas police here are not supposed to be arresting for minor amounts of marijuana, but they keep putting people in the jail for it. The DA has said he won't prosecute for minor amounts, but they keep arresting people. And when you get arrested, you may lose your job. You may lose your house, depending on how long you sit there for. If you can't afford your bail, you may lose your job, your housing. Your kids might go, unwatched for a couple of days. They have to go. So there's very real cost to all this, and that's something we try to be mindful of when we try to show people in our reporting is you're paying for it one way or another. Like this system, whether they're going to go, you're shifting the burden of the justice system from the state courts to the federal in Oklahoma with some of these cases. But, with locking women up for these minor drug crimes and sitting in prison, it's costing the taxpayers a lot of money. So you have to really look at, is this a sound and just system? Does it make sense? Does it, obviously we want to have laws, we want people to follow the laws, but if people keep getting locked up because I think the lady that I talked about with the school uniforms, her prior crimes that they kept bumping her bail up for was she stole paper towels and she stole soap one time. So, that's the other side of the story we're trying to get. Like if you just looked at her bail sheet, you think she's a bad girl, $150,000, then you get into her arrest reports, you're like, oh, she sold soap and paper towels from the Walgreens. So that's that other side of the story that I'm always trying to get, whether it's tribal justice or folks sitting in the county jail. But it's, those are the kinds of things that we work really hard to highlight at the Marshall Project to try and show people, this is you're paying for this, guys. These are your tax dollars. How do you want to spend them?
Great, thank you so much. Do you have any last concluding thoughts for us before I conclude this event?
Well, I was going to tell people to read Killers of the Flower Moon, but you guys already did that. But if you're very interested in kind of keeping up with these issues or kind of learning, well, obviously the Marshall Project, we have a lot of coverage of these issues nationally on our site. If you're interested in Indigenous affairs and some of those issues, High Country News does a fantastic job of covering it. And I actually have subscribed to the print edition myself now because I love it so much. And I learn things from the part of the country that I grew up in that aren't getting covered. And I really like that. So I would just encourage you guys to always support your local newspaper or support investigative journalism, whatever nonprofit works for you, or whether it's in your home state. The Frontier is one that we started in Oklahoma and it's still going 5 years later. But I just, keep reading and keep asking questions. And please, if you have any questions that didn't get answered or you're too shy to raise your hand, I'm on Twitter. You can reach out to me on Twitter, or you can always email me at caspinwall@marshallproject.org.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Cary Aspinwall and to all of those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific. Professor Diana Selig will be moderating a panel on the 19th Amendment and the future of gender equality. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much.